The wind in the New Mexico territory of 1878 did not whisper. It screamed. It was a high, thin sound that scoured the paint from the few buildings strong enough to stand against it, and it carried the grit of the high desert into a man's teeth, into his lungs, until he tasted nothing but the land itself. This was Dry River Junction, a place named for a hope that had long since dried up with the creek bed. Here, the dust was the only crop that never failed. It settled in the folds of a woman's skirt, in the bottom of an empty cup, and in the deep lines around a man's eyes. The railroad had bypassed them by 20 miles, and God, it seemed, had bypassed them by a generation. In this year, flour was gold. A drought that had lasted 2 seasons had burned the wheat to chaff in the fields. What little grain came in on muleback was hoarded, traded, and sometimes killed for. A sack of flour was not food. It was a future. A handful was not a meal. It was a prayer. And on this night, the wind was howling a prelude to a special kind of misery. Inside the emptied-out granary, the air was thick with the smell of stale grain, unwashed bodies, and the sharp tang of cheap lantern oil. This was where the town's broken pieces were sold. The auction was held at night because the darkness hid the shame on the faces of the bidders, or perhaps because it matched the darkness in their intentions. There was no cash here. The currency was survival. Men leaned against the rough-hewn pillars, their hands resting protectively on burlap sacks stamped with mill logos from 50, sometimes 100, miles east. These were the wealthy. These were the men who would eat through winter. At the front, a man named Silas Croft, who owned the dry goods store and thus the town's hunger, stood over an overturned rain barrel. He banged a heavy wooden mallet against its warped top. The sound was dry, finite, a hollow crack that echoed the brittle bones of the starving. They had already sold the bakery's assets. The cooling racks, the heavy dough hook, the cracked kneading trough. The baker had fled in the night, owing everyone, leaving his debts behind like spoiled flour. And now, they sold the last of his inventory. Last lot, Silas bellowed, his voice grating. The baker's final debt, to be worked off. Ilara Quinn. He motioned to the shadows. A man, smaller but quicker than Silas, shoved her forward. She was 19 years old. She stumbled into the flickering yellow light, her wrists bound in front of her by a length of rough hemp rope. The rope had already rubbed the skin raw, leaving angry red welts that looked like burns. Her dress, once a pale blue calico, was torn at the shoulder and smeared with grime and a dusting of white flour, as if she were the last remnant of the bread she could no longer bake. Her hair was the color of dry wheat, pulled back and matted with the same pervasive dust that coated everything. But she was not broken. Her chin was up. Her eyes, a deep gray, moved slowly over the crowd. She was not crying. She was counting. She was memorizing. A low murmur moved through the crowd. Men shifted. This was different from selling a trough. What's the bid for the debt? Silas demanded, enjoying the sudden tension. She's young, strong back. She can knead, she can scrub, she can serve. A thick, guttural laugh came from the front row. Trask Hollander adjusted the polished star on his vest. He was the deputy, but he was also the provisions broker, a dangerous combination in a starving town. He controlled the law and the food, which meant he controlled the life and the death. He was clean-shaven, his face pale and fleshy, and he smiled as he looked Ilara up and down, his gaze lingering. "I'll take the debt," Trask said, his voice smooth. 1 50-pound sack. She can serve her time at my offices. Keep the place swept. The men knew what swept meant when Trask said it. 1 50-pound sack, Silas grinned, ignoring the implications. A fine price for a strong girl, and the baker left this too. The smaller man shoved a small, heavy hand mill onto the barrel. The mill is included in the price. More laughter. Crude. Braying. A girl for 1 sack and a grinder. Someone slurred from the back. Ilara's eyes locked on Trask. She did not flinch, but her hands, bound at the wrist, tightened into fists so hard her knuckles went white. Trask enjoyed her stare. He savored it, letting the moment stretch. He was about to own her defiance. "Going once," Silas called, eager to close the deal with the town's most powerful man. "Going twice." The heavy plank door of the granary groaned open on its leather hinges. The wind tore into the room, making the lantern swing wildly, throwing grotesque shadows across the walls. The scream of the desert silenced the auctioneer. A man stood framed in the doorway. He was tall, broader than the door itself, and he brought the outside with him. He smelled of cold air, wet canvas, and the sharp, clean scent of ozone, the smell of rain just before it breaks. He wore a heavy oilskin duster that fell to his boots, dark with saturation and trail dust. He pulled off his wide-brimmed hat, beating the grit from it against his leg, and revealed dark hair, cut short. He looked to be about 35. His face was hard, carved from the same rock as the mesas, but it was his eyes that held the room. They were gray, like Alara's, but they were not defiant. They were cold. They were still. They were the color of a winter sky over a frozen lake. This was Macklin Hayes, a widower, a man who owned the Hidden Mesa Ranch, a spread so remote folks said he preferred the company of canyons to people. He was a man who spoke little and worked hard, and he was not known for visiting town. He let the door swing shut, the sound a dull thud. His spurs were silent. He walked with a predator's economy, his gaze sweeping the room once. He ignored Trask. He ignored Silas. His eyes landed on Alara. He saw the raw wrists. He saw the flower on her dress. He saw the defiance in her stare. He held her gaze for a long second. An assessment, not an appraisal. "The auction is proceeding." "Hayes," Trask said, annoyed by the interruption. His hand drifted near the pistol on his hip. Macklin gave no sign he had heard. "Sold. To Deputy Hollander." Silas raised the mallet. Macklin Hayes lifted one finger. It was not a bid. It was a command. The mallet froze in the air. The room, which had already fallen quiet, seemed to suck the last of the air from the granary. Macklin moved. He did not walk around the crowd. He walked through it. Men who had been leaning on their precious flour sacks scrambled to pull them out of his path. He stopped, not at the bidding line, but directly in front of the rain barrel, standing between Alara and the men who sought to buy her. He looked down at Silas. He unslung a heavy burlap sack from his shoulder and dropped it. It hit the floorboards with a heavy, solid thud that shook the barrel. He reached back and pulled another thud, and a third thud. 3 sacks of flour, a king's ransom, more flour than most men there had seen in a year. Trask's face went white, then mottled with a dark, rising red. You can't just. Macklin reached into the inner pocket of his duster. He didn't produce a weapon. He produced a folded piece of paper. He tossed it onto the barrel. "That's 3 sacks. Macklin's voice was low, rough, like stones moving over stones. It cut through the dust, and a lien on my winter wheat harvest. It pays the baker's debt in full." He turned his head slowly, and for the first time, looked at Trask Hollander. No man owns a man. The silence that followed was absolute. Trask's hand was shaking, hovering over his gun, but he did not draw. To draw on Macklin Hayes over this, in front of the whole town, was a fool's move. He had been beaten not by force, but by resources. In the territory. That was the deeper cut. Silas Croft. Eyes wide and fixed on the flower. Swallowed. He looked at Trask, then at Macklin. He saw the quiet promise of violence in Macklin's stance, and he saw the immediate, tangible wealth at his feet. He chose the flower. Crack! The mallet hit the barrel so hard it nearly split the wood. "Debt settled," Silas yelled, his voice cracking. Auction concluded. The crowd did not cheer. They recoiled. They moved back as one, melting toward the door, scattering into the night. They wanted no part in the aftermath of this. Trask Hollander had been publicly shamed, and a debt like that would be paid in something other than flour. In seconds, the granary was empty, save for the 4 of them. Silas, his small helper, Trask, Macklin, and Alara. Trask's eyes were slits of pure hatred. He looked at Alara, then at Macklin. He spat on the floor. "You bought yourself a problem." "Rancher," Trask whispered. his voice suddenly venomous. Flour spoils, and winter wheat. It burns. He turned, his boots grinding the spittle into the dust, and slammed the door behind him. Silas, terrified, scrambled to drag the sacks away, the small man helping him. It's good. Mr. Hayes, the debt is clear. We're good. Macklin paid him no mind. He stepped onto the low platform. Alara flinched back, expecting a hand to grab her, to claim the purchase. Instead, he pulled a skinning knife from the sheath on his belt. The blade was worn but sharp. She closed her eyes, turning her head away. She felt not a cut, but a sudden release. He had sliced the hemp rope. It fell away from her wrists. She stood there, rubbing the raw, chafed skin, staring at the floor, waiting for the next command. She heard the heavy sound of his oilskin duster being shrugged off. A heavy weight settled on her shoulders. It was the coat. It was huge on her, swallowing her small frame, the hem pooling at her feet. It was warm from his body, and it carried that strange, clean smell of the oncoming storm. She looked up at him. His gray eyes were unreadable. He had not touched her skin. He nodded once toward the open door, where the wind was now driving a cold, fine rain. Alara pulled the heavy coat tighter. It was the first true warmth she had felt in a year. She walked past the empty barrel, past the pile of flour that had been her price, and stepped out into the night. The drizzle was cold, stinging her face, but the coat was armor. She stopped by his horse, a big gray gelding that stood patient in the weather. Macklin was checking the cinch, his movements efficient and practiced. She had to ask. The fear of the unknown was worse than the certainty of Trask's cruelty. Her throat was dry, coated in dust. Her voice came out as a low, hoarse rasp. What do you want? Macklin Hayes paused, his hand on the saddle. He didn't look at her. He looked out into the darkness, toward the high dark line of the mesas. For you to be fed, he said, his voice flat, and to sleep under a roof that holds. He swung himself up into the saddle in one fluid motion. He looked down at her. He didn't offer a hand to pull her up. He didn't command her to follow. He simply waited. Alara Quinn stood in the mud of Dry River Junction, draped in a coat that smelled like rain. She looked back at the granary, the place where her life had been valued at 3 sacks of flour and a grinder. Then she looked at the man on the horse. He had not bargained for her. He had not appraised her flesh. He had not, in that whole time, laid a hand on her as if she were property. She put her foot in the stirrup he offered, and let him pull her up behind him. The ride to Hidden Mesa was silent, broken only by the plodding of the gray gelding's hooves in the thickening dust and the snap of Macklin's oilskin duster in the wind. Alara sat behind him, her hands gripping the high, hard cantle of the saddle. She refused to hold on to him. The duster he had given her in the granary was draped over her lap, a heavy shield against the cold. His back was a solid wall in front of her, rising and falling with the horse's gait. The wind had died, but the silence it left was heavier. The sky had turned from a bruised purple to a solid, pressing gray, the color of wet slate. The smell of rain that had clung to Macklin in town was now everywhere, thick and metallic in the air. The first drop hit Alara's cheek, cold and fat. Then another. Within a minute, the high desert air, which had been clear moments before, was a sheet of driving water. Macklin did not hurry the horse. He seemed to expect it, to know its timing. He turned the gelding's head, leaving the faint trail and angling toward a high wall of dark red rock that formed the base of the mesa. He guided the horse under a deep overhang, a natural cutout carved by 1,000,000 years of wind. He dismounted, the soft thud of his boots absorbed by the damp sand. The rain roared just beyond the edge of their shelter, a curtain of noise that shut out the world. He turned to her. He did not offer a hand to help her down. He simply stood by the stirrup, waiting. She swung her leg over, her muscles aching, and slid to the ground. Her knees nearly buckled, but she locked them, refusing to show more weakness. Macklin turned his back to her, facing the storm. He unfastened his saddlebag, his movements economical and sure. He pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle. "It's a 2-hour ride from here," he said, his voice quiet under the roar of the rain. We'll wait out the worst of it." He opened the cloth. Inside were 2 squares of cornbread. He held one out. Ilara stared at his hand. It was large, the knuckles scarred, the nails trimmed short. It was a hand that knew work. It held the bread steady. She hesitated. It was a test, but when she looked at his face, he was not watching her. He was watching the rain, his gaze fixed on the gray wall of water. He was giving her the privacy of her own hunger. Her hand, still marked with the red grooves of the rope, darted out and took the bread. It was dense and dry, made with more meal than flour, but she devoured it in 3 bites. The crumbs caught in her throat, and she coughed. A dry, harsh sound. He offered no water. He simply ate his own piece, his movements slow, methodical. He asked no questions. He did not ask her name, where she was from, or what she had done to end up on Silas Croft's auction block. The silence he offered was a gift, a clean space where she did not have to be the girl from the granary. After 10 minutes, the gelding, which had been standing with its head low, suddenly lifted its head and snorted, its ears swiveling back toward the trail they had left. Macklin's body went still. He put a hand on the horse's neck, his eyes scanning the curtain of rain behind them. He saw nothing but the storm, but he had felt it. The air had changed. Ilara saw the tension lock his shoulders. He was listening to something she could not hear. "What is it?" she whispered. "Nothing," he said. "The rain is letting up. Time to go." The word was a lie, and they both knew it. He swung back into the saddle and waited. She mounted behind him. This time, when the horse lunged forward into the drizzle, her hand instinctively brushed the solid warmth of his back before she gripped the saddle again. They rode higher, climbing a switchback trail she had not seen from the desert floor. The ranch was well named. It was tucked into a high fold of the mesa, invisible from below, protected on 3 sides by sheer walls of red rock. A log house, a sturdy barn, and a web of juniper post fencing stood against the clearing sky. The place was not built to be pretty. It was built to endure. As they approached, the smell of cedar from the log walls was sharp and clean in the rain-washed air. He dismounted at the hitching post and tied the gray. He walked to the porch, but he did not enter. He waited for her. Ilara walked toward the house. This was the moment. He had paid the debt. He had fed her. Now, the bill would come due. He opened the door and stepped aside, holding it for her. She entered, her shoulders tensed, expecting the sour smell of a bachelor's cabin stale whiskey, old sweat, unwashed linens. The room was clean. It was dark, but the air was cool and smelled of wood smoke from a cold hearth. She saw the simple, strong lines of furniture in the gloom. Macklin walked past her to the main fireplace, built of large, smooth river stones. He lit a kerosene lamp on the mantel, and the room filled with a soft, yellow light. It was one large room, kitchen and parlor in one. A heavy table, scrubbed clean, dominated the center. At the table, there were 3 chairs, a 4th chair, a rocker, sat by the cold fireplace, angled slightly toward the room. It was not dusty. It was not piled with blankets or harness. It was empty, but it was not unused. It was kept. It was a space that was actively held open. Ilara looked away from it. It felt like trespassing. Macklin went to the hearth. He knelt, his broad back to her, and stirred the gray embers. He added a handful of dry kindling from a wooden box, his movements precise. Ilara stood by the door, the damp wool blanket still clutched around her shoulders. She was an intrusion in this house of ghosts. "You're cold," he said, not looking at her. He nodded to the table. "Sit, eat." He moved to a screened cabinet and took out a heavy brown loaf, a slab of butter, and a stoneware jar of what looked like pickled beans. He went to a low pantry and returned with a tin pitcher of milk. He placed it all on the table. Ilara sat, choosing the chair farthest from the empty rocker. She looked at the food. It was more than she had seen in one place in months. The hunger, which she had held back with the cornbread, returned with a violent, cramping force. Her hands shook. She tried to saw a piece of bread, but her trembling was so bad she nearly dropped the knife. She tore a piece off with her fingers and stuffed it into her mouth, chewing and swallowing so fast she could not taste it. She reached for the milk, her knuckles white, and drank half the glass in one long, shuddering pull. Macklin had not sat. He was at the fire, tending the new flames. He did not watch her. He did not comment on the animal way she ate. He poured a glass of milk for himself and pushed the pitcher closer to her side of the table. "Here," he said, his voice low and rough, seeming to resonate from the stone of the fireplace. "The hungry eat first. Talk later." She ate until the cramps in her stomach subsided, replaced by a dull, heavy ache. The shaking in her hands eased. She was warm from the food, but the dampness of her clothes and his duster still chilled her to the bone. Macklin watched the fire catch. The room was growing warmer, but she was still shivering. He stood and went to a large cedar chest at the foot of a built-in bunk. He lifted the heavy lid. The scent of cedar, sharp and sweet, filled the room. He reached inside and pulled out a blanket. It was heavy wool, folded perfectly. As he shook it out, she saw the pattern a complex, beautiful design of deep reds, charcoal gray, and a startling line of turquoise. It was a Navajo weaving, worth more than the flower he had paid for her. He walked to her. She flinched, expecting him to take his duster. Instead, he took the damp, heavy oilskin from her shoulders and replaced it with the blanket. He draped it around her, his hands brushing her shoulders for only a second. The wool was soft, incredibly warm, and smelled faintly of cedar and something else, a subtle, dry scent, like lavender. A woman's smell. This was Nora's blanket, his wife's. The realization hit Alara with the force of a physical blow. He was wrapping her in his dead wife's shroud. The gesture was an intimacy so profound, so complex, it terrified her. She looked up at him, her throat tight. "Those who've been cold," he said, his gray eyes meeting hers, "know how to keep others warm." He turned away and went back to the fire, leaving her to absorb the weight of his words. And the blanket. The rain had settled into a steady, drumming rhythm on the roof shingles. The fire crackled. The house was quiet, insulated from the world by the storm and the stone. Alara's gaze traveled the room. It was a man's room, but it was not a rough room. The books on the shelf were straight. The floors were swept. Her eyes stopped on the wall above the cedar chest. On 2 wooden pegs hung an old guitar. The wood was dark, almost black in the firelight, polished smooth in the places a hand would rest. Slowly, she stood, pulling the heavy blanket around her. She walked to the instrument. She did not take it down. She reached out one finger, her nails still caked with the grime of the granary, and plucked the highest, thinnest string. The note was clear and sweet. It hung in the warm air, a single, perfect sound. She touched another string, then a third. She fumbled, finding the notes of a chord she half remembered. A simple tune her mother used to hum back in Kansas. A song about the wide, flat plains and the color of the sky before a summer storm. It came out hesitant, broken. Macklin watched her. He had been cleaning his Winchester, the lamplight gleaming on the oiled barrel. He saw her touch the guitar, heard the faltering notes. He set the cleaning rag down. He stood, walked to the mantel, and placed the rifle onto its heavy wooden hooks. The click of the rifle settling into the rack was the only sound. It was a deliberate act, the disarming of the house. He turned to the fire, his back to her, and bent to add a larger log. His shoulders were wide, blocking the light from the flames, but his movements were gentle, as if he were afraid of making a sound that would break the fragile cord still hanging in the air. He stoked the fire until the log caught, sparks rising up the chimney. Finally, he spoke, his voice still quiet. "There's a cot in the pantry. The linens are clean. It's the warmest spot, near the hearth." He turned to face her. The firelight cut shadows across his face, making his eyes impossible to read. "In the morning, the well is to the east. The water is sweet." He paused, holding her gaze. "If you want to leave, I won't keep you. The trail back to town is easy to follow when it's not raining. Alara looked from his steady gaze to the window, where the rain was now a silver blur. He was giving her a choice. Trask had tried to buy her. The baker had tried to own her. This man, who had paid a fortune for her, was opening the door. She realized, with a sudden, cold jolt, that staying was more dangerous than leaving. To leave meant returning to a world she knew, a world of hunger and desperation. To stay meant trusting this quiet, sad man who spoke in riddles and wrapped her in his dead wife's blanket. Staying felt like a promise she wasn't sure she could survive. She just nodded, pulling the wool tighter. Outside, beyond the juniper fence line, the rain had almost stopped. A figure, soaked to the skin, crouched behind a line of boulders. He had seen the light in the window. He had watched the smoke rise from the chimney. He was one of Trask's men. He had marked the trail. He smiled, a cold, wet grimace in the dark, and slipped away, his movement silent as a coyote. In the barn, Macklin's gray gelding, tethered and dry, lifted his head from the hay. He let out a low, breathy huff, a warning that vibrated in his chest. He smelled the lingering trace of the intruder on the wind. Inside, Macklin, banking the coals for the night, paused. He tilted his head, listening. He had heard nothing, but the horse had. The brief peace of the storm was over. He looked at Alara, who was watching him, her eyes wide in the firelight. "Sleep," he said. "You're safe tonight." She knew tonight was the only promise a man like him would make, and it was the only one she could believe. Dawn at Hidden Mesa did not arrive with a song. It arrived as a cold, gray line of light that slowly separated the black rock from the black sky. Alara woke to the smell of cedar. She had slept on the narrow cot in the pantry, wrapped in Nora's blanket, and for the first time in a year, she had not dreamed of running. The sleep was heavy, deep, and left her feeling slow. Her bones still settled in the quiet of the night. The house was silent. The hearth was cold. Macklin was already gone. A familiar panic, thin and sharp, cut through the warmth. She had been left. He had paid the debt and, upon seeing her in the light of day, had ridden off. She threw the blanket off and hurried to the door. The air was bitingly cold, scrubbed clean by the rain, but Macklin was not gone. He was in the corral, his back to her, working with the gray gelding on a long lunge line. He moved with a quiet, patient rhythm, his voice too low for her to hear, a murmur meant only for the horse. She watched him for a moment. He was not a man who wasted motion. Her panic subsided, replaced by a different, more practical anxiety. She was a guest. She was a burden. He had said the east well had sweet water. She would earn her keep. She found a bucket by the porch and walked east, following the line of the rock wall. The ground was damp, dark, and smelled of wet minerals. She found the well. It was not a deep, stone-lined structure, but a shallow cistern, dug into the earth and shored up with juniper posts. And it was dry. It was not just low. The bottom was a circle of cracked, dark mud. The rain had run off, not sunk in. A cold fear, deeper than the fear of Macklin leaving, touched her. Water was life. Without it, the ranch died. She knelt at the edge, and she saw it. Pressed into the mud near the lip of the well, partially protected by a flat stone, was a boot print. It was fresh. The rain had stopped hours ago, but this print was sharp, its edges defined. It had been made in the dark, just before dawn. It was not Macklin's boot. His were worn smooth at the heel. This print was new, with a deep, military-style tread. Beside it, scattered on the rock, was a small pile of gray ash and the burnt, half-inch nub of a cigar. Not a hand-rolled cigarette, a thick, expensive cigar. The kind Trask Hollander smoked in the dry goods store. She heard no footsteps, but a shadow fell over her. Macklin stood behind her. He had come up as silently as the morning light. He looked at the dry well, then at the print, then at the ash. His face, already hard in the morning chill, seemed to carve itself from the rock around them. He squatted, his knees cracking. He did not look at her. He reached out and touched the cigar ash, rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger. He studied the boot print, noting the tread, the size. They were at the property line. He said. His voice was flat. Ilara's breath caught. They one man, he corrected, his eyes scanning the perimeter. He came down from the north rim while the ground was still soft. He stood. With the heel of his boot, he deliberately scuffed the print, destroying its shape, grinding it into the mud. He scraped the ash from the rock and buried it under a layer of damp earth. He was erasing the sign, hiding the snake's trail from her. He came for the water, she whispered. He came to look, Macklin said. He turned and started back toward the barn. The cistern by the house is spring-fed. It's full. We use this well for the stock. She understood. He was dismissing the water problem, which was real, to focus on the man problem, which was immediate. Trask had sent a scout. When they returned to the house, the tension was a physical thing, a third presence in the room. He did not speak of the man at the well. He lit the fire in the cook stove, his movements methodical. The smell of coffee soon filled the small space, but it did not feel warm. Ilara knew she could not be a guest. She could not be a protected thing. She had to change the terms. Mr. Hayes, she began. He glanced at her, taking 2 tin cups from a hook. Macklin, I need to work. I don't take charity. It was not charity. It was a debt. The baker's debt. Now I have a new one. To you. Her eyes fell on the counter. Sitting there, cleaned of the granary's grime, was the small, heavy hand mill. He must have retrieved it. She walked to it, put her hand on the iron handle. I can work, I can grind, I can cook, I will earn my bed. He looked at her for a long time. He saw she was not asking for a job. She was demanding her own standing. She would not be the girl he bought. She would be the woman who worked. He respected the iron in her. He nodded once. We have corn that needs grinding. The barn needs mending. I am strong, she said. I know, he said, pouring the coffee. As he handed her a cup, a sharp, metallic rattle cut through the air. A tink, tink, tink sound from outside. Macklin's body went rigid. His gaze snapped to the window. What was that, Ilara asked. The wind box. He set his cup down and walked out onto the porch. Ilara followed, pulling Nora's blanket tighter. A thin wire was strung from the porch post to the barn eaves. Halfway across, a rusty tin can dangled, dancing in the morning breeze. A line of string ran from the can down to the ground. It was a crude alarm, or a messenger. Macklin reached the post and hauled on the string. The can traveled along the wire, rattling toward him. He stopped it, reached inside, and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He unfolded it. His face, which had been merely hard, now darkened with a contained, cold fury. He did not hide it. He did not burn it. He looked at her, then handed her the paper. She took it. The script was heavy, arrogant, and black. 4 words. Flour still owed. The note was a match. Her memory was the kindling. She was back in the bakery. Not the smell of Macklin's coffee, but the sour, damp smell of failing yeast and old debts. Mr. Greaves, the baker. A man with a damp handshake and desperate eyes. He had offered her a flour contract. She remembered signing the paper, her hand unsteady. 1 50-pound sack of flour in exchange for 3 months of work. She would knead the dough, fire the ovens, scrub the floors. But the flour had run out in 4 weeks. The drought had choked the supply lines. The town was starving. You still owe me. Ilara. Greaves had whined, his small hand gripping her arm. The flour dust on his skin felt like chalk. The contract is for 3 months, but perhaps we can arrange interest, a new payment in kind. She remembered the way his gaze had dropped from her face to her body. She remembered the click of the lock on the bakery door that night. The realization that the debt was not for flour. The debt was for her. She had waited until he slept. She had grabbed the hand mill, the only thing in the shop that was small enough to carry and valuable enough to trade, and she had run She had run to Silas Croft at the dry goods store, begging for protection. Silas had looked at her, a starving girl with a stolen mill, and had seen an asset. He had locked her in the storeroom. He told Greaves he had secured the debt. He had arranged the auction. Trask was not the beginning of her nightmare. He was just the end of it. The paper fluttered from her numb fingers. She was shaking, the deep, racking tremors she had felt at Macklin's table. Macklin saw the terror in her eyes. He saw her mind flee back to that dark place. He picked up the note, crumpled it in his fist, and tossed it into the open firebox of the stove. The paper flared and turned to black ash. "He won't stop," she whispered, her voice hollow. "He'll try," Macklin said. She looked around the clean, empty room, at the single rifle on the wall, at the man who had traded his survival for her. "Why?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Why did you do it? You don't know me. You have nothing. That flower, that was your winter." He didn't answer immediately. He stared into the fire. His gaze drifted to the empty rocking chair by the hearth. The anger and the tension seemed to drain from his shoulders, replaced by a familiar, crushing weight. "I have the ranch," he said, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. "It's a place to put the pain." He finally looked at her. "The pact, the truth. When it's time. Nora, my wife, she died 3 years ago." He spoke the words like they were stones he was lifting. "Malaria, the fever came up from the river bottoms. This was her home. She loved this place, the red rock, the smell of the juniper." He looked at the chair. "I don't stay here to be alone. Miss Quinn, I stay because if I leave, she's gone. This ranch is the last place she was alive. I am guarding the memory." Ilara looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time. He was not a savior. He was not a hero. He was a widower, standing watch over a grave. He had bought her not because he wanted a woman, but because he was a man who understood loss, and he had seen Trask trying to create more of it. "Ilara," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "My name is Ilara, and we have a pact." "We do." "We're allowed our silence," she said, nodding toward the rocking chair. "For Nora, and for—" She nodded at the stove, where the note had burned. "For that. But when we speak the truth." Macklin considered her words. A hard rule for a quiet man, but a fair one. "The truth," he agreed. "When it's time." The pact settled the air. The truth, spoken and unspoken, gave them a foundation. They were no longer a man and his ward. They were two people with ghosts, standing against a common threat. The day's work began. Macklin went to the barn to mend a stall door that had cracked in the storm. Ilara took the bag of dried corn and the hand mill. She sat on the porch, the sun finally warm on her back, and began to grind. The rhythmic scrape of the iron was work. It was purpose. The reality of Trask's note pressed on her. Flour still owed. She thought of the empty granary and the bakery. She thought of Macklin's 3 sacks. She stopped grinding, driven by a cold dread. She walked to the small shed behind the house, the granary. She pulled the heavy wooden bar and opened the door. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light. It was clean. It was swept, and it was completely empty. The bins where he should have kept his wheat, his flour, his seed, all bare. The 3 sacks he had thrown on the granary floor in town. That was not some of his flour. That was all of it. He had traded his entire winter for her. She ran, the empty mill in her hand, back to the barn. Macklin was fitting a new hinge. "The granary," she said, breathless. "It's empty." He did not stop his work, I know, but the winter. If the drought holds, if the harvest fails, you'll starve. "The harvest won't fail," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Trask knows," she said, the pieces locking into place with a cold, terrible click. "He knows you're empty. That's why he sent the note. He's not attacking. He's just waiting. He's waiting for the snow to fall and for us to starve." Macklin stopped hammering. He set the hammer down on the railing. He walked out of the barn and stood in the bright, unforgiving sunlight, staring north. "He's not just waiting," Macklin said. He pointed. Ilara followed his gaze. In the damp earth. now drying in the sun. She saw what she had missed that morning. Faint but clear. The tracks of a heavy wagon. Not a buckboard, a freight wagon. The ruts were wide and deep. "Those tracks are fresh," Macklin said, his voice cold. "Made this morning, before the rain stopped." He was checking the well, but he was also checking his path. Where do they go? They lead north, toward the old Apache silver mine. The mine, it's abandoned. It's abandoned by prospectors, Macklin said. Trask uses it. It's his private depot. It's where he hoards the grain he buys low and sells high. He keeps the town hungry, and he sells his own illegal stock from the mine at night. That's where his man came from this morning. That's where all the flour in this territory is. Alara looked at the faint wagon tracks leading into the wilderness. She looked at the empty granary. She looked at the house. She walked back to the porch. She picked up the iron hand mill. Its weight familiar, solid. This was the tool of her enslavement. This was the bonus prize in her auction. Macklin came and stood beside her. "I will not starve," Alara said, her voice low and hard as the iron in her hand. "And I will not be a debt. He thinks he can get me back when your flour runs out." She turned to face him, her gray eyes as cold as his. "My entire life, I have been weighed against grain. I am done letting anyone else set the price." 3 weeks passed. The high desert sun was a hammer, beating the moisture from the air. But the single rainstorm had left a promise in the ground. At Hidden Mesa, a routine settled in. It was a partnership forged in silence and necessity. Alara rose before the sun, grinding the corn that was their staple. Macklin tended the stock, mended the fences, and studied the sky, reading the clouds for any sign of another break in the drought. They ate together, speaking little, but the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the scrape of her mill and the sound of his whetstone on an axe blade. But the corn was running low, and they had no seed for the winter wheat. The ranch, Alara had learned, had a small, fallow field, protected by the mesa wall, with a deep well that had not yet run dry. It was their only hope. "We need seed," she said one morning, looking at the near-empty sack of corn. "Seed costs flour." He said, "No." She said, "We have corn. We have the mill. We have my hands." Dry River Junction's market day was a swirl of dust, noise, and desperation. Ranchers who still had cattle sold them for pennies. Women sold preserves from a better year. Alara set up a small table near the church, a clean cloth spread over a crate. On it, she placed 24 flat, golden corn cakes, wrapped in pears and corn husks. The smell of baked corn and honey was a small, defiant island of comfort in the dusty street. Macklin did not stand with her. He was across the square, pretending to inspect a saddle, but his eyes never left her. He was coiled, his duster hooked back behind the holster on his hip. He had not wanted her to come. "It's my mill," she had argued. "My labor, my right to trade." She sold the first dozen cakes quickly, not for cash, but for barter. A widow gave her a small tin of salt. A rancher gave her a handful of dried beans. It was not seed, but it was food. The square quieted. It was not a sudden silence, but a slow draining of sound, the way water sinks into dry sand. The bartering stopped. People stepped back from the center of the street. Alara looked up and felt the air go cold. Trask Hollander was walking toward her. He was not in his dusty deputy gear. He was dressed in a clean, dark suit, his white shirt brilliant in the sun. He looked like a banker or an undertaker. He smiled, a polite, practiced expression that did not touch his eyes. He was a velvet-wrapped dagger. He stopped at her table, his gaze moving over the corn cakes. He picked one up, inspected it, and dropped it back onto the cloth, as if it were soiled. "Miss Quinn," he said, his voice soft, conversational. "I am pleased to see you have found employment, though I am afraid it is in violation of a prior contract." Alara's hands, which had been steady all morning, went numb. "I have no contract with you," she said, her voice low. "Not with me, no," Trask agreed, still smiling. He reached into his coat pocket. "With the Greaves Bakery. An ironclad agreement for 3 months of labor, signed by your own hand. When Mr. Greaves fled, his assets were forfeit to his creditors. As the holder of his largest note, I am his sole creditor. His assets, Miss Quinn, include your debt." He produced the paper, the same one she had signed, the one she had fled. He held it out for her to see. A few townsfolk, emboldened by the legal drama, crept closer. They whispered. A signed contract, that was law. On the frontier, a man's name on paper, or a woman's, was a shackle. The debt was paid. Alara said, her voice shaking, "The debt for your sale was paid to Silas Croft." Trask corrected her, his voice patient, as if explaining to a child. "A fine point of law. But this is a labor contract, a different ledger entirely. I am here to collect. You will come with me." He was not threatening. He was not yelling. He was simply stating a fact, and the law, thin as it was on his side. "She is not going with you." Macklin's voice cut across the square. He had not moved from the saddle shop, but his voice carried, cold and clear. He began to walk toward them, his steps measured, his spurs silent. He did not look at Trask. He looked at Alara. He stopped on the other side of the small table. He was now the wall between her and Trask. "Hayes." Trask sighed, dropping the polite facade. "You've had your fun. Now step aside. This is a legal matter. It's a debt," Macklin said. "Debts can be paid." Trask laughed. "With what more of your phantom harvest, the whole town knows you emptied your granary for her. You have nothing." Macklin reached into his own coat. He pulled out a worn, leather-bound ledger, the ranch accounts. He slapped it onto the table, next to the corn cakes. "This is the note for Hidden Mesa, my land, my water." He then unhooked 2 empty grain sacks from his belt. "You want payment? I will pay double the contract. 2 sacks of flour, guaranteed against the ranch itself. Take the payment. Release the paper." The crowd gasped. The ranch! He was betting his entire spread on her. Trask looked at the ledger. He looked at the empty sacks. He looked at Macklin's hard, defiant face. A slow, ugly understanding dawned in his eyes. He had wanted to break her. He was realizing he had to break him first. He smiled again. That same dead smile. A generous offer. Rancher. He reached out and picked up the ranch ledger. He held it, weighing it in his hand. Macklin's muscles tensed, his hand hovering near his pistol. Trask tore the book in half. He ripped the pages from the binding and threw them to the ground. The wind scattered the accounts of Nora's life, of Macklin's heritage, across the dust. Trask leaned in, his voice a venomous whisper that only Macklin and Alara could hear. "People are not traded for flour. Hayes, they are traded for fear." He spat on the ruined ledger. "She learns to fear me again. Or you learn to fear for her. It makes no difference. She is mine." He nodded. A man Alara had not noticed. A thick-shouldered man in a red shirt stepped out from the alley. He moved fast. He was not coming for Macklin. He was coming for her. He grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her skin. "Time to go. Girl!" He raised his other hand, the one holding a heavy Colt pistol. He was not going to shoot. He was going to pistol whip her, to drag her from the square. Alara did not scream. She reacted. She snatched the tin of coarse salt from the table and threw the entire contents into the man's face. He roared, a sound of pure agony, and dropped the pistol, his hands flying to his eyes. The salt, sharp and raw, blinded him instantly. A second man, coming from the other side, lunged at Macklin. Macklin did not draw. He moved with a speed that was shocking in a man his size. He met the man's rush, not with a fist, but with his shoulder, deflecting the charge. He grabbed the man's arm, twisted, and used the man's own momentum against him. It was not a brawler's move. It was a rancher's move. The way a man might pin a calf or break a stallion. He hooked his leg, heaved, and threw the man over his hip. The thug flew backward, crashing into a stack of empty rain barrels. The sound of splintering wood and the man's pained grunt echoed across the square. In 3 seconds, it was over. The man with the salt was on his knees, screaming. The man in the barrels was not getting up. Macklin stood, breathing hard, his gaze locked on Trask. Trask had not moved. He had not even flinched. He simply watched, his expression one of mild disappointment, as if his dogs had failed a simple trick. The county sheriff, a man named Brody with a tarnished badge and a weak chin, finally bustled forward. "Now, Trask, Mr. Hayes, let's not have a war in the street," he stammered, his eyes darting between the two men. Trask just looked at him. That one look was enough. The sheriff fell silent. He was Trask's man, or at least too afraid not to be. The entire town was watching. They were not watching the sheriff. They were measuring. They were watching Trask, and they were watching Macklin. They were waiting to see who was the stronger animal. Trask's hand slowly moved, brushing his suit coat back, revealing the polished handle of his own pistol. "It is still a valid contract." "Sheriff," Trask said softly, "I aim to have it honored." Macklin's hand fell to his gun. This was it, a draw in the middle of the street, a draw he could not win. Ilara saw it. Trask had men. She saw another on the roof of the dry goods store, holding a rifle. A third was by the horses. They were surrounded. Ilara grabbed Macklin's arm. Her hand was firm, her grip strong. "Macklin, no, not here." Her voice was low, urgent. "Withdraw." It was not a plea. It was a command. He looked at her. He saw not the terrified girl from the granary, but a partner, a tactician. She was right. To fight here was suicide. He let his hand fall away from his pistol. His jaw was tight, a knot of fury working under the skin. He gave Trask a single nod, a promise of a future reckoning. Then he turned, his eyes scanning. He noted the man on the roof. He noted the two men by the horses. He counted. He measured the distance. He filed the information away. He grabbed the bag of beans and the few coins they had earned. "Let's go," he said to Ilara. They walked away, his back to Trask. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. The crowd parted, letting them pass, their eyes filled with pity and fear. No one spoke. Trask did not stop them. He let them go. The humiliation of the retreat was his victory. As they rode out of town, Ilara looked back. Trask was calmly picking up the torn pages of Macklin's ledger, one by one. They rode back to Hidden Mesa in a silence that was thick and black as storm clouds. When they reached the gate, Ilara saw it first, hanging from the top post of the gate, tied with a strip of fresh rawhide, was the bleached white, articulated skeleton of a 4-foot rattlesnake. Its fangs were bared, its body coiled as if to strike. It was a border challenge, a warning. "You are trespassing on my land. What is yours is mine. I will strike." Ilara felt a cold sickness rise in her. The note had been a threat. This was a declaration of war. Macklin dismounted. He did not look at the snake. He walked to the small pouch on his saddle where he kept his seed. He pulled out the tiny, precious bag of beans. He walked to the gate, untied the rawhide, and took the skeleton down. He did not throw it. He carried it to the small fire pit by the side of the house. He took a match from his pocket, struck it on his boot heel, and lit the pile of dry kindling inside. When the flames were high, he dropped the snake skeleton into the fire. Ilara stood beside him, watching the bones blacken and curl. The firelight flickered in Macklin's cold, gray eyes. "He wants us afraid," Ilara whispered. "He wants us gone," Macklin said. He looked at the small bag of beans in his hand, then at the fallow field beyond the house. "Tomorrow, we plant the seed, Macklin. That's not enough to... It is what we have," he said, his voice flat and hard as the iron of her mill. He turned to her, the firelight catching the planes of his face. "He thinks the answer is fear. The only answer to a man like that is not to be hungry. We plant, we survive. We do not let him starve us out." The war against Trask Hollander began not with a gunshot, but with the scrape of a shovel against hard, dry earth. They had to plant. The small, fallow field Macklin had saved was protected, but the well nearest to it was the deep one, the spring-fed cistern by the house, to bring the water to the field. They needed a ditch. It would be nearly a quarter-mile long, winding around the rockfall at the base of the mesa. The sun was a tyrant. For 2 days, they dug. Macklin worked with a relentless, steady rhythm, his powerful shoulders splitting the baked soil, the pickaxe rising and falling, the shovel clearing the trough. He was a machine built of grief and endurance. Alara worked beside him. This was not the work of a bakery. This was the work of a chain gang. The wooden handle of the shovel was rough, unseasoned. By noon on the first day, her hands were raw. By sundown, they were bleeding. She hid the pain, curling her fingers into her palms, wiping the blood on her skirt, her face set in a mask of determination. She would not be the weak link. She would not be the debt. They ate that night in silence, too tired to speak. Her hands throbbed so badly she could barely hold the spoon. The second morning, the pain was a white fire. She gripped the shovel, the raw blisters on her palms tearing open again, the salt of her own sweat stinging the wounds. She bit her lip until she tasted copper and kept digging. Macklin stopped. He was knee-deep in the ditch, his shirt soaked with sweat. He was watching her. "Stop," he said. "I'm fine." She lied, her voice tight. "Stop." He climbed out of the ditch in one motion. He walked to her. He did not ask. He simply took the shovel from her hands. The handle was stained dark. He looked at her palms. They were a raw, red map of her effort. "You'll get blood poisoning," he said. His voice was flat, but it held a new, rough edge of anger. Not at her, at the shovel, at the ground. "We have to finish," she said, cradling her hands. "Not like this." He walked into the house. She waited, ashamed, feeling like a failure. She had broken? He returned. He carried a small tin of axle grease, which he used as a salve, and a roll of clean, white cloth. He gestured for her hands. She held them out, shaking. He knelt in the dirt in front of her. He took a dollop of the black, pungent grease and, with a touch that was surprisingly gentle, spread it over the raw blisters. She hissed as it stung. "It will keep the dirt out," he said. Then he took the cloth. She recognized it. It was not rough muslin. It was fine, soft linen. He unrolled it, took his knife, and cut 2 long, clean strips. The cloth smelled of cedar and lavender. It was from the chest. It was Nora's. He was tearing up his wife's dowry sheets to bandage her hands. "Macklin," she whispered, trying to pull away. "You can't. That's—" "It's cloth," he said, his voice rough. He didn't meet her eyes. He wrapped her hands firmly, expertly, his large, scarred fingers moving with a surgeon's care. He tied the knots, his touch lingering for a second. "The dead have no use for linen. The living have work to do." He stood, handed her the shovel, its handle now slick with the remaining grease. "Hold it steady. Let the legs do the work, not the hands." She gripped the handle. The pain was still there, but it was muffled, cared for. She looked at her bandaged hands, wrapped in the memory of another woman. She looked at him, his face hard, his eyes on the horizon. "Thank you," she said. He just nodded. "We're burning daylight." They finished the ditch by sundown. The small trickle of water that flowed from the cistern to the parched field was the most beautiful thing Alara had ever seen. That night, the partnership changed, with the planting done. Their few beans and the last of the traded corn seed in the ground. The reality of their empty larder returned. They had a small sack of cornmeal left, perhaps 10 pounds. "We make it last," she said. That night, she taught him. She showed him how to mix the coarse meal with water and a pinch of salt, how to knead it, not with force, but with patience, folding the air into it, making the dense, gritty meal lighter. His hands, so sure with an axe or a horse, were clumsy with the dough. He was too strong, his movements too hard. "No," she said, moving beside him at the table. "Like this." She put her small, bandaged hands over his, guiding his movement. "It's not a fight. It's a conversation." He froze. Her hands were on his. The linen was a soft barrier, but he could feel the warmth of her through it. He could feel the fine bones of her hands, the strength she held in reserve. He pulled back as if burned. "I'm no baker," he growled. wiping flour on his pants. "You're doing it wrong." She took the dough, her own movements fluid, rhythmic. "You have to listen to it." He watched her. The firelight caught the earnest set of her jaw, the fine strands of hair that had escaped her braid. "This is harder than breaking a horse," he muttered. A sound startled him. It was a small, breathy noise, like a rusty gate hinge forcing itself open. Alara was laughing. It was the first time. Her head was down, but her shoulders were shaking. The sound was quiet, fragile, but it lit the small kitchen, brighter than the kerosene lamp. You look like you're trying to choke it," she managed, another small laugh escaping. A slow, almost painful smile cracked the hard granite of Macklin's face. He watched her, and for a moment, the ghost in the rocking chair seemed to fade. "All right," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "Show me again. The next day." He taught her. "You live here. You ride." He said. He saddled the gray gelding. "You came here as a passenger. You will not stay one." He taught her how to swing the heavy saddle, how to find the horse's center, how to tighten the cinch. He taught her to read the gelding's ears, to know the difference between a flick of irritation and a pin of fear. Then he taught her the sky. He took her to the edge of the mesa. "You're from Kansas," he said. "Flatland. You look at the ground. Here, you look up." He pointed to the horizon. "See that line of high, thin cloud? That's mare's tails, means wind in 2 days. See the way the mountains to the south are sharp? That means the air is dry, no rain. You learn to read that. You learn when to plant, when to ride, and when to stay home." She stood beside him, not a pupil, but a partner. He was giving her his knowledge. She had given him hers. They were building a fortress, not of logs, but of shared skills. The house began to change. One afternoon, Macklin was mending a harness. He pulled a small, tarnished silver spoon from his pocket. It was bent, the bowl cracked. It was old. From a set, Nora's. He did not throw it away. He went to his workbench, drilled a small hole in the handle, and tied it with a piece of fishing line to a bent nail. He hung it from the porch eaves. When the wind blew that evening, it was not the rattling, urgent alarm of the tin can. It was a single, clear, sweet chime, a quiet heartbeat for the house. They ground the last of the cornmeal. Alara poured it into a clean burlap sack. She took a piece of charcoal from the hearth. On the rough burlap, she wrote one word, not a price, not a weight. Alara. It was not a label. It was a signature. The most profound change came a week later. On 4 legs. A dog appeared at the fence line. It was a stray, some mix of hound and coyote, its ribs sharp under its dusty yellow coat. It was starving, wary, and scarred. Macklin raised his rifle. A stray dog could mean rabies. "No," Alara said, putting her hand on the barrel, gently pushing it down. She went inside. She came back with the small pitcher of milk from that morning's meal. She poured the milk, their precious milk, into a bowl. She set it on the ground, halfway between the porch and the gate. "It's a waste of food," Macklin said, but he had lowered the rifle. "Nothing that's hungry is a waste," she said. She sat on the porch step. Macklin sat beside her. They waited. For an hour. The dog did not move. Then, inch by inch, its belly low to the ground, it crept forward. It watched them, its eyes wide with fear, ready to bolt. It reached the bowl, lapped the milk in frantic, desperate swallows, and then retreated. Not to the wilderness, but to the shade under the porch. It stayed. "He's covered in grit," Alara said, watching the dog lick its paws. "Dusty," Macklin said. And just like that, the dog had a name. The stray, like them, had found a home. He slept on the porch, a silent, yellow guardian, his presence a new, warm weight. The nights were the hardest. The silence was deep. The fear of Trask was a living thing that crept in with the cold. One night, they sat on the porch, the new wind chime singing its quiet song. Dusty was asleep at Alara's feet. The sky was a spray of white diamonds, so clear it hurt to look. A thin, perfect crescent moon hung over the mesa. "Nora," Macklin said. his voice quiet. She favored the new moon, said it was a promise. Alara watched the sliver of light. She pulled Nora's blanket tighter around her. The pact, truth, when it's time. I'm afraid of the night, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Not the dark, but the sound of a lock. He turned to look at her. The baker, Greaves, she said, her voice flat, recounting the memory. He locked the door. The sound of the bolt sliding home. I knew what it meant. I hear it every time I close my eyes. Macklin said nothing. He just stared out at the dark line of the mesa, his jaw tight. The next day, he rode to town. He returned with a small, heavy parcel. It was not food. He spent the afternoon at the front door. He was chiseling the wood. He removed the old, simple iron latch. In its place, he installed a brand new, heavy brass deadbolt, a real lock, with a keyhole. When he was finished, he tested it. The sound of the bolt sliding home was not a click. It was a heavy, solid, definitive thud. He turned to Alara. He held out his hand. In his palm was a single, shiny brass key. She looked at it, confused. It's the only one, he said. It locks from the inside. I sleep out here. You sleep in the pantry. This is your door now. She understood. He was giving her the power to lock the door against him. He was making himself a prisoner of her safety. It was the most profound act of trust she had ever known. Her hand, no longer bandaged, her palm scarred but healed, closed over the key. The metal was warm from his skin. She started, but the words choked her. You're safe here, Alara, he said. That night, the house was different. The sound of the bolt sliding home was not a threat. It was a promise. She did not retreat to the pantry. She came out onto the porch. Dusty thumped his tail. Macklin was already there, leaning against the post, looking at the stars. She stood beside him. They were close. The shared silence was no longer a truce. It was a comfort. Her hand rested on the porch rail. His hand was there, inches away. She could feel the heat of his skin in the cool night air. Slowly, deliberately, his fingers brushed against hers. Just a touch. The scarred knuckles against the back of her hand. It was not a grasp. It was a question. She did not pull away. She let her hand rest against his. A long, quiet moment passed. The sky turned. The wind chime sang. Macklin let his breath out, a sound he seemed to have been holding for 3 years. He stepped back into the house. He returned with the guitar. He sat on the steps, his back against the post. He began to play. The tune was not for her. It was for himself. It was a slow, sad melody, simple and full of aching space. It was a song for a man riding alone, a cavalry tune, a dirge for a lost patrol. Alara sat on the top step, pulling the blanket around her. She listened to the notes, to the story of his grief, played out in the dark. When he finished, the silence was heavy. She answered him. She did not sing. She hummed. It was a small, quiet sound, a melody from her own past, a simple Kansas folk song, a tune about planting corn and waiting for rain, a song her mother had hummed while kneading dough. Her hum blended with the high, thin sound of the wind. Macnext's fingers found the strings again, picking out a low harmony, finding her key. His sad cavalry song, and her quiet song of the plains. The two melodies met, wove together, and rose as one into the cold, starry dark, on a ridge 100 yards away, hidden by the rocks. The man from the well lay on his stomach. He had a small spyglass. He had been watching the house for an hour. He had seen the two figures on the porch. He had seen them sitting close. He had seen the stray dog at their feet. He saw the flicker of the lamp as they sat, not in separate rooms, but together in the main cabin, listening to the guitar. He lowered the glass. He wrote a note in his small book. Trask had told him to watch the girl, to wait for the man to tire of her. But the watcher knew. This was not a man and his debt. This was a man and his woman. The target was no longer just Alara. To break her, Trask would have to burn the ranch, and the man to the ground. The sky turned yellow at 3 in the afternoon. It was not the yellow of a healthy sunset, but a sick, bruised, sulphurous color. The wind, which had been a steady presence for days, suddenly stopped. The world went utterly still. The air grew heavy, thick, and tasted of dry clay. From the porch, Macklin watched the horizon. Dusty, the yellow dog, whimpered from beneath the steps, his nose pressed into the dirt. "Ilara," Macklin said, his voice quiet, but it carried an urgency that made her blood run cold. "Inside, bolt the door. Put wet cloths under the threshold." "What is it?" she asked, joining him, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. "The dry storm," he said. He pointed to the north. A low, rolling cloud, the color of rust, was consuming the sky. It was not a cloud of water. It was a cloud of the world itself. Before she could move, it hit. It was not a wind. It was a wall, a solid mass of sand, grit, and earth moving at 60 miles an hour. The sound was not a howl. It was a physical roar, the sound of a mountain being ground to dust. The sun vanished. The world went from yellow afternoon to absolute black midnight in a single second. Grit, fine as flour, blasted Ilara's face, stinging her skin like 1,000 needles. She screamed, but the sound was stolen from her mouth. Macklin grabbed her, shoving her toward the door. "Get in!" As she scrambled inside, a sound, louder than the storm, cracked through the air, a sound like a giant bone snapping. Macklin, halfway through the door, froze. He looked toward the barn. No, he breathed. Through the swirling brown blackness, he could just see it, the main crossbeam of the barn roof. It was bowing upward, lifting, the wooden pegs straining against the force. The wind was trying to peel the roof off, to gut the building, to take the gray gelding and their few tools with it. "The rope!" he bellowed over the roar, his voice already hoarse. "From the well I'll get it," she yelled back. "Stay inside. That's an order. It's my home too," she screamed. And before he could stop her, she had tied her apron over her nose and mouth and plunged back into the maelstrom. They collided at the well, two blind figures in the apocalypse. Macklin already had the heavy hemp rope. "To the barn. Stay behind me." He was a wall breaking the worst of the wind. She held onto the back of his shirt, her head down, her lungs filling with dirt. The air was not air. It was a suffocating, abrasive weight. The barn was a screaming chaos. The gray gelding was rearing in his stall, his eyes white with terror. The beam, Macklin yelled, pointing up. He threw the heavy rope over the groaning, splintering wood. The wind ripped it from his hand. He tried again, finally snagging it. "Hold the line," he shouted to Ilara. "Hold it, or we lose everything." He looped his end around the main support post, pulling the slack. "Ilara!" Her small frame a pathetic anchor against the storm. Wrapped the other end of the rope around her body, her feet planted in the hay, her bandaged hands gripping the hemp. "Pull," he commanded. She leaned back, all her weight, all her will, against the line. The rope burned through her bandages, but she held. Macklin scrambled up the stall wall, climbing like a bear. He reached the beam, his hammer in his belt. He was trying to get to the main joint, to brace it. The wind hit a new pitch, a high, keening shriek. The roof lifted, pulling Ilara a foot off the ground. She screamed, her feet dangling, but she did not let go. Macklin saw her. He abandoned the joint, sliding back down. He grabbed the rope with her, his weight added to hers, their bodies together against the storm. "Hold on," he roared into her ear. "It will break, or it will pass. Just hold on." They stood there for an eternity, two small, defiant figures, shoulder to shoulder, holding the roof of their world down by a single strand of rope. The barn shuddered around them, dust and chaff filling the air until they could not see the horse, only hear his panicked screams. Ilara's arms were fire, her back felt broken, but she focused on the solid, warm presence of Macklin beside her. He was an oak. She would be the stone at its base. And then, as suddenly as it began, the wind eased. It did not stop, but the cyclonic, roof-tearing force abated, settling into a steady, brutal gale. The beam groaned, settled back into its socket, and held. For a full minute, they just stood, gasping, their chests heaving, still holding the rope. It's holding, Ilara panted, her voice cracking. Macklin nodded, his face a mask of sweat, hay, and grit. He looked at her, his eyes wild in the gloom. Ilara let her breath out. The rope slipped from her useless hands. The world, which had been a swirl of brown and black, simply tilted on its axis. Her knees buckled. Ilara. She heard his voice, distant, as if from the bottom of a well. She saw him reach for her as she fell, and then the world went black. She woke to the smell of the fire, not the dry, abrasive heat of the storm, but the clean, warm scent of burning juniper. She was on the rug, in front of the hearth. The house was dark. The windows were opaque, caked with a thick layer of brown dust. The only light was from the fire, which roared in the stone fireplace. The storm still howled outside, a muffled, angry sound. But it was outside. A warm, wet cloth was on her forehead. "You're awake." Macklin was sitting in the rocking chair, the one he rarely used. He was leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, watching her. He was caked in filth, but he had washed his hands. "The barn," she whispered. Her throat felt like it was full of sand. It held. You held. He reached for a tin cup warming on the hearth. "Drink. Slow." He lifted her head with one hand, his touch surprisingly steady, and held the cup to her lips. It was warm water, sweetened with a drop of their precious honey. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. It slid down her raw throat, easing the burn. She drank it all, and he gently lowered her head. She felt the heavy weight of Nora's blanket on her. I fainted," she said. "Shame washing over her." "You were exhausted," he said, his voice flat. "You've been running on empty for a year. Today, the tank ran dry." She lay there, listening to the fire and the wind. She felt weak, but she also felt, for the first time, completely safe. The storm could not get in. Trask could not get in. She pushed herself up on one elbow. The movement pulled at her sleeves. She looked at her hands. The linen bandages were torn, blackened with grime and rope burns, but she felt no pain. She looked past the bandages, at her wrists, at the auction. The hemp rope had bitten deep, leaving raw, circular burns. For weeks, they had been angry, red and swollen, a physical reminder of her price. She stared at them now in the firelight. The wounds were gone. The skin was pale, smooth. In their place were only faint, thin white lines, the color of old paper. They had faded. She had been so focused on the new wounds, the blisters on her palms, that she had not noticed the old ones, the ones of her bondage, had healed. He had done this, not with salves or medicines, but with quiet respect, with a key to a lock, with a shared song in the dark. He had given her a place where her body could finally stop fighting and just heal. She looked at him. He was watching her, his gray eyes catching the reflection of the flames. He saw her staring at her wrists. He knew what she was seeing. The silence in the room was no longer quiet. It was full. It was charged with the work of the barn, the shared fear, the honeyed water, the healing scars. She sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. She did not move to the pantry. He did not move to the door. They were two survivors, sealed in a tomb, the only living things left. He knelt by the fire, his back to her, adding another log. The muscles in his shoulders and back moved under his filthy shirt. He was a man made of coiled rope. He stayed there, kneeling, watching the flames. "Ilara," he said. His voice was thick, raw from the dust. He turned his head. He did not face her fully. "May I touch you?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the dust. He was not Trask, to take. He was not Greaves, to barter. He was Macklin, to ask. He was a man who had paid a fortune for her, and he was now asking for the simple permission to touch her hand. She could not find her voice. Her throat was too tight. She just nodded, a small, jerky movement. He turned fully. He moved slowly, as if approaching a skittish foal. He knelt in front of her on the rug. He did not reach for her body. He did not reach for her face. He reached for her hand, the bandaged one. He took it in his own, his calloused, dirt-caked palm cradling her wounded one. He just held it. His thumb gently stroked the back of her hand, just below the bandage. She looked at their joined hands, his, large and dark. Hers, small and pale. She made a sound, a small, broken thing, a sob that had been trapped for a year. His eyes met hers. She leaned in, or he did. They met in the middle. The first kiss was not a kiss. It was a pressure, a question. His lips were chapped, tasting of dust and the salt of his own sweat. It was hesitant, unbelievably gentle, and it was over in a second. He pulled back, his eyes searching hers. She gave him her answer. She put her free hand, the one that was not bandaged, on the side of his face, her fingers pressing into the rough stubble of his jaw. She did not pull him closer. She just held him, returning the touch, returning the question. He closed his eyes, a shudder passing through him. He leaned in again. This time, it was a kiss. It was slow. It was deep. It was respectful. His hand moved from her hand to her elbow, then to her shoulder. A simple, solid point of contact. His other hand came up, not to her head, but to her back, resting in the small of it. A support, not a cage. She kissed him back. She kissed him with the memory of the auction block, of the locked room, of the terror, and the memory faded, burned away by the simple, clean warmth of this man. He pulled back, resting his forehead against hers. They breathed the same air, their breath mingling, warm and dusty. "This isn't," he whispered, his voice thick. "This isn't a trade. I'm not paying for your work." "I know," she breathed, her hand still on his face. "No more prices, no more buying, only this," he said, "just giving." He kissed her again, and this time the fire in the hearth found a spark inside the room. The gentleness was still there, but beneath it was a deep, slow-burning heat. The heat of a man who had been alone for 3 years. The desperation of a woman who had never, not once, been safe. Her hands, which had trembled in the granary, were steady. They moved from his face, gripping the front of his shirt, holding on. His arm tightened, pulling her from the rug, lifting her slightly, bringing her flush against him. His heavy duster, the one that had been his armor against the world, was a barrier. He shrugged it off, letting it fall to the floor beside them. The fire crackle snapped. A log settled, showering the hearth in a brief burst of orange sparks. It was the only sound besides their breathing, which was no longer steady. The lamplight on the mantel cast their joined shadow against the log wall. It was a single shape. The view pulled back, past the bolted door, past the window caked in earth. It moved to the porch, where the small, silver spoon Macklin had hung was ringing, a wild, high, sweet chime in the fury of the storm. Dawn. The storm had passed. The world was buried. A foot of fine. Red dust covered everything, smoothing the hard edges of the land, making the world new and silent. The light in the cabin was pale gray. Alara stirred. She was on the rug, her head on Macklin's shoulder. He was sitting up, his back against the cedar chest. He had not slept. His arm was securely around her, holding her, even in sleep. She was burrowed into his side, Nora's blanket draped over both of them. He watched the pale light grow. He looked down at her face, peaceful in the dimness, her eyelashes dark against her cheek. She was no longer the defiant girl from the auction, or the terrified woman in the storm. She was just Alara, asleep. He looked at her, this small, fierce woman who had stood beside him, who had held the line. He bent his head, his lips brushing her hair. He looked at her the way a man, having survived the hurricane, looks at the one standing wall of his house, the one part that did not break, the one part that meant home. The peace lasted for 1 day. It was a day spent digging out from the dust storm, a day of shared, aching muscles and quiet acknowledgement. They had survived the sky. They had held the barn. They were, for one brief, uninterrupted day, A fortress of two. The next morning, the new war began. It started not with fire, but with its opposite. Elara went to the spring-fed cistern by the house, the one that fed their newly dug irrigation ditch. The water level, usually constant, had dropped by 2 feet. The trickle moving toward their tiny, hopeful field of beans was gone. The ditch was just a dry scar. She ran to Macklin. He was already by the corral, his face turned north, listening. "It's not just the cistern," he said, his voice flat. "The air is wrong. The well is silent." He saddled the gray gelding. He did not tell her to stay. He just waited for her to mount the mare. They rode north for a mile, following the dry wash that fed the aquifer under his land. They found the source of the silence. The stream, a shallow but steady current that was the lifeblood of the high mesa, had been diverted. A new, crude dam of rock and dynamite spoil choked the water. The stream was being rerouted, forced into an old, dry arroyo that led east, away from hidden mesa, toward the vast, empty holdings Trask Hollander had been buying up. 3 men, the one with a cigar among them, sat on the rocks, rifles across their laps, watching the water change course, and with them, looking miserable and ashamed, was Sheriff Brody. "Macklin," the sheriff called out, holding up a hand, "and a piece of paper. This is legal. All legal." "The hell it is," Macklin growled, his hand falling to his holster. "It is," Brody insisted, shuffling forward. "Mr. Hollander. He went to the land office. He found an old Spanish mineral grant, predates the territory, gives him primary water rights to this entire springhead. He filed the claim in Santa Fe. It's the law." "That's my water," Macklin said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Not anymore," said the man with the cigar, smiling around the butt of a fresh smoke. "It's the boss's water now, and he's thirsty." Macklin looked at the 3 rifles. He looked at the useless sheriff. He looked at the dam. He was a man of action, but he could not shoot a piece of paper. He could not win a gunfight against 4 men and the law. He turned his horse. Elara followed, her heart a cold stone in her chest. They rode back in silence. Within 3 days, their field was cracking. The beanstalks, which had been so green, withered and turned yellow. The corn shoots, which had been 2 inches high, fell over and died. The earth turned to gray-white alkali. Hunger, which had been a visitor, now came to stay. Trask had been surgical. He had not burned them out. He had not shot them. He had simply turned off the tap. He had made their home, their sanctuary, unlivable. Macklin fell into a dark, quiet rage. He spent his days sharpening tools that had no use, mending fences that held in no stock. His jaw set so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. He was trapped. Elara watched him. She watched the field die. She would not let this stand. "If the ranch starves, he wins," she said one evening, her voice cutting through the heavy silence of the cabin. Macklin just grunted, running an oiled rag over his rifle. "He controls the water. He controls the law. He controls the town because he controls the flour," she said, thinking aloud. "We cannot fight his law. We cannot fight his dam, but we can fight his flour." He finally looked at her. "We have the mill," she said, touching the heavy iron handle. We have a little corn left, enough for a week. Maybe. And then what we eat the mill know," she said, her eyes bright with a sudden, dangerous idea. "We make cakes, the hard cakes, and we go back to town. We trade. For what no one has anything, Trask owns the bank, the store, and the flour. They have seed," she said, "the other small ranchers, the ones who looked away. They're just like us. They're hoarding. They have small bags of seed, beans, wheat, waiting for rain. They are starving too, but they are saving their future. We will trade them food now for seed later." "They're too afraid of Trask." "They are," Elara agreed, "but fear doesn't taste as bad as hunger. We have to show them they are not alone." The next day, they rode to town. They had 20 hard, dry corn cakes, their entire remaining supply, wrapped in the last of Nora's linen. Elara did not go to the market square. She went to the church, in the dusty patch of shade by the bell tower. She put down her crate and laid out the cakes. Macklin stood 20 yards away, his duster back, his rifle in his saddle scabbard, but his gaze sweeping every rooftop, every alley. The town watched. Faces peered from behind curtains. Men in the saloon stopped their games to look through the dirty glass. Sheriff Brody saw them and quickly walked the other way. No one approached. The fear Trask had sown was a wall, higher and thicker than the one at the stream. Alara waited. An hour passed. The sun beat down. She knew then that bread was not enough. She had to give them something more. She stepped up onto the wooden crate. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear, and it carried in the thin, dry air. "You all know me," she began. The faces in the windows became more distinct. "My name is Alara Quinn, and you watched me sold on an auction block. Right over there. You watched me sold for flour." A murmur went through the hidden crowd. "You watched Trask Hollander try to buy me. You watched Macklin Hayes pay my debt. And now, you are watching Trask Hollander starve him out, starve us out." She pointed north. "He stole our water, the water that belongs to the mesa. He holds a piece of paper that says he owns the stream. He holds a piece of paper that says he owns me." She held up one of the hard corn cakes. "He owns the flour. He owns the store. He owns the sheriff. He owns everything, except us. He does not own our willingness to stand together." Her voice grew stronger, ringing with a conviction she had not known she possessed. "He told Macklin Hayes that people are not traded for flour, but for fear. And he is right. He is trading on your fear. He keeps you hungry so you will stay afraid. He keeps you apart so you will stay weak. I am not selling this bread," she declared, her voice resonating off the church wall. "I am starting the community flour exchange. I am trading one of these cakes for one handful of seed. Any seed. Bean, wheat, corn. We put it all together. We bake together. We share together. We will not let him starve us. One by one." Silence. A hawk cried overhead. Then, the small, rattling sound of a door. The widow, the one who had traded Alara salt weeks before, walked out of her small house. She was old, her back bent, but her eyes were clear. She walked directly to Alara, past the staring, hidden faces. She held out a small cloth pouch. "It's not much," the widow said, her voice thin. "Barley. From my husband's last crop. But it's seed." Alara took the bag and, in exchange, gave the woman 2 cakes. The widow's act broke the spell. A man, one of the small ranchers Macklin had spoken to, strode out of the saloon. He threw a small sack of pinto beans onto the crate. "She's right. Damned if I'll be starved out by that bastard." A spattering of applause, thin and hesitant, came from an open window. Then another man, and a woman. They came, one by one, with handfuls of seed, with dried chilies, with a precious half-bag of potatoes. The pile on Alara's crate grew. Macklin watched, his hand never leaving his gun, but a look of dark pride in his eyes. 3 other ranchers, their faces grim, walked not to Alara, but to Macklin. "She's got more spine than the whole town. Hayes," one said, "he cut your water. He'll cut ours next." "What's the plan?" said another. Macklin looked at the church door. "We make a new law, one he can't buy." He took a piece of charcoal from Alara's bag and, on the back of a wanted poster, drafted a new agreement, a water-sharing compact. It pledged that the 4 of them, the last of the independent ranchers, would share all remaining well water, rotating access, defying Trask's legal blockade with their own mutual survival. They all signed it. Macklin nailed it to the church door. For the whole town to see, it was a declaration of war. The retaliation was swift. That night, they were at the ranch. They had brought the seeds, their new, shared wealth, and stored it in the small granary shed attached to the barn. They were exhausted, but for the first time, hopeful. Just after midnight, Dusty, sleeping on the porch, shot to his feet. A low, vibrating growl started deep in his chest. Macklin was out of his bedroll before the dog's growl turned to a frantic, choking bark. "What is it?" Alara was at the door, the key in her hand, Smoke! Macklin grabbed his rifle and burst outside. The night was not dark. It was lit by an orange, flickering light. The granary shed was on fire. The water, Ilara screamed, running for the cistern buckets. Macklin sprinted to the barn, not for water, but to get the horses out. The gray and the mare plunged out of the main doors, their eyes white with terror. The arsonist was long gone. This was not a fight. It was an execution. They fought the fire with a desperate, silent fury. They were not just saving a building. They were saving the town's seeds, their last hope. They used horse blankets, soaked in precious cistern water, beating back the flames that licked at the main barn wall. They fought for an hour. Finally, the flames subsided, leaving a smoking, charred ruin of the small shed. The main barn was saved, but the seed... Macklin kicked at the smoldering debris. Half. They had saved half. The rest was ash, the smell of roasted corn and beans thick in the night air. Dusty was still barking, sniffing frantically at the edge of the clearing. Macklin stood, breathing heavily, his face black with soot. He was beaten. The water was gone. Now the food was gone. But Ilara was not looking at the fire. She was on her knees, 20 yards away, where Dusty was sniffing. "Macklin," she said, her voice cold, sharp. He joined her. She was pointing at the ground, at a patch of damp earth near the cistern, missed by the firelight. In the mud was a perfect boot print, the same military-style tread from the dry well, and beside it, dropped in the grass, was the stub of a half-smoked, expensive cigar. Ilara picked it up. It was still warm. "The scout," she whispered. "Trask's man. The one from the mine." She handed the cigar stub to Macklin. He looked at it. He looked at the boot print. He looked at the smoldering ruin of their hope. All the fight, the planning, the pacts. All useless against a man who would send a shadow with a match. "He's right," Macklin said, his voice terrifyingly quiet. "You can't fight him with talk. You can't beat him with baked goods." He looked toward the dark, northern hills. He uses paper to block the water and fire to burn the seed. Macklin said, the pieces fitting together. And he uses a ledger to keep the town in chains. The contract, Ilara breathed, the one he holds over me, over Greaves. And how many others, Macklin said. How many people in that town signed a flour contract? He's not just hoarding flour in that mine. He's hoarding lives. He's keeping a ledger of every soul he owns. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the dull, red glow of the embers. "We can't win by digging wells. We can't win by planting beans. We win by destroying his power. We have to destroy the ledger." A new, cold resolve settled over them. This was the only path. "I'll go tonight," Macklin said. "Alone." "No." Ilara stood, wiping the soot from her face. "You're a rancher. I'm a baker's apprentice. I know what his ledgers look like. I know how he marks his debts." "Ilara, this isn't a debate in the street. This is breaking and entering. The man with the cigar will be there. They will shoot you on sight." "They will shoot you on sight," she countered, her voice hard. "But me, I'm just a girl he's trying to get back. I'm your cover, and I'm your partner. We do this together." She met his gaze, unflinching. "My name is in those pages. I'm going to be the one to help you burn it." The sky was starless, a heavy black velvet pressed against the land. It was a moonless night, the kind that thieves and ghosts prefer. 3 figures rode low, staying in the shadows of the dry washes, their horses' hooves muffled by the sandy soil. Macklin led, his face set, his rifle resting easy across his saddle. Ilara followed, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. She was not the terrified girl from the auction. She was a soldier. The third rider was new, Owen, the young postboy from town. He was barely 20, a wiry frame of youthful energy that had hardened into grim resolve. The granary fire had burned away his neutrality. He had come to them the next day. "Mr. Hollander, he does not just stop the water. He stops the mail." Owen had stammered, his face pale. "He reads it. He controls the news. He controls everything. I know the roads. I know the patrols. I can watch your back." The Apache silver mine was a black maw in the side of the mesa, a place the locals avoided. It smelled of cold, damp earth, sulfur, and the metallic tang of old silver dust that glittered faintly in the air. They dismounted a quarter-mile out, tying the horses in a deep stand of juniper where they would not be seen. They moved on foot, shadows against the rock. Macklin carried his rifle. Owen had a small pistol. Alara carried a dark lantern, its shutters closed, and a heavy, cloth-wrapped bundle. It was the iron hand mill. They reached the entrance, a gaping, timber-shored hole. Macklin paused, listening. The only sound was the wind, high and thin, like a distant scream. He nodded. 10 yards inside, the air grew cold and still. Macklin's hands shot out, his arm barring Alara's path. He stopped her without a sound. He knelt. He pointed. In the faint light from the mine entrance, she saw it, a thin, taut wire, stretched at ankle height from one timber to the other. Macklin's fingers traced it into the darkness, where it snaked up the wall. He pointed again. A cluster of small, brass bells, hanging just above their heads. A trip line. "Owen, watch the entrance," Macklin breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "Signal if you see a light." Owen nodded, melting back into the deeper shadows of the entrance. Macklin studied the wire. "I can cut it, but the release in tension might be enough." "No," Alara whispered. She knelt beside him, unwrapping her bundle. "The hand mill, it's taut. It needs a counterweight." "Not a cut. If we just add weight, the clappers won't move." She took the heavy iron mill. It was the tool of her enslavement, the price of her shame. Now, it was her key. Her hands, scarred from the digging and the fire, were perfectly steady. She did not approach the wire from the middle. She moved to the side, near the timber post. She slowly, silently, hooked the heavy iron handle over the thin wire. The wire sagged under the weight. The bells, their lines now slack, drooped. Their clappers rested uselessly against their inner walls. They were silenced. Macklin looked at her, his eyes unreadable in the dark. He gave a single, respectful nod. He took the lantern from her. He unhooked one shutter, allowing a single thin beam of yellow light to cut through the oppressive black. They moved deeper, the air thick with the dust of the mountain's bones. The tunnel opened into a large, vaulted chamber, and Alara's breath caught. It was Trask's hoard, sacks of flour. Hundreds of them were stacked 10 feet high, a pale, ghostly mountain range in the single beam of light. There were crates of tinned goods, barrels of salted meat, kegs of blasting powder. This was the town's stolen lifeblood. In the center of the chamber, like a throne, sat a heavy oak desk and a chair. Behind it, bolted to the rock floor, was a black iron safe. It was 3 feet high, scarred, and imposing. "There," Macklin said. He handed her the lamp. "Keep it on the lock." He pulled his tools from his saddle pouch, a heavy chisel and a small flask of coal oil. He knelt, examining the dial. Then the hinges. He dripped the oil into the seam, his movements precise. He set the chisel. He tapped it once with the butt of his knife. The tink of metal on metal was a gunshot in the silent chamber. They both froze. They waited, their hearts pounding against their ribs. Nothing. Only the distant echo, dying in the tunnels. "It's too loud," Alara whispered, her voice trembling. "He'll have a guard. This is the guard," Macklin said, tapping the safe. "But you're right. It's too slow." He stood, frustrated. Alara moved forward, holding the light higher. She examined the desk. It was meticulously neat. A clean blotter, a pen holder, an inkwell, and a small, leather-bound ledger. Her heart leaped. She grabbed it. She opened it. The pages were blank. Her hope fell. But as she closed the cover, she felt something tucked inside the back. A single, folded piece of paper. She unfolded it. The light fell on a hurried script. Greaves, 4 right. 19 left, 33 right. Overdue. It was a combination. Macklin. She held the paper out, her hands shaking. He took it. He knelt again. He put his ear to the cold steel of the safe. his large, rough fingers spinning the dial. The sounds were tiny, precise, absorbed by the stone. Click. He spun it left, past the 19, and back. Clack. He spun it right. Click. He grasped the heavy, T-shaped handle. He pulled. It did not move. He pulled harder, his shoulders straining. With a groan of protesting metal, the heavy bolts retracted. The safe door swung open. The smell of old paper, dry ink, and sealing wax rolled out. It was full. Ledgers, 3 of them, and a small, wooden box. Macklin opened the box. Inside, nestled on red velvet, was a heavy brass seal and a stick of red wax. The seal of the New Mexico Territory. A forgery. Alara ignored it. She reached for the largest ledger, the one bound in black. She pulled it out and opened it on the desk. The beam of the lantern fell on the first page. Alara Quinn, Ode Greaves Bakery. Acquired. Value 3 sacks flour, contract 3 months. She ran her finger under the line, as if to wipe it away. She turned the page. Sarah Mills, Ode Dry Goods. Acquired. Value 1 sack flour, 10 pounds coffee, contract 6 months. Maria Gonzalez, Ode Livery. Acquired. Value $10 medicine. Contract 1 year, mending, page after page. 20, 30 names. Women she saw in town every day. The widows, the daughters, the wives of broken ranchers. All itemized, valued in flour and coffee, their lives reduced to a line of black ink. He owns them. She breathed, horrified. He's been collecting them, just like Greaves, just like Silas. He owns the whole town, a sound, a single sharp whistle, cut off from the entrance. Owen, then the sound they had dreaded, the distant thunder of hoofbeats. Not one horse, many, riding hard. They're here, Macklin said, his voice cold. He grabbed the ledgers, shoving them into Alara's arms. He grabbed the fake seal and the wax. The back way, there has to be an air shaft. A shot cracked through the night, from outside the mine. Owen, firing his pistol into the air, riding in the opposite direction. The boy, Macklin hissed. He's drawing them off. He bought us time. Go! He grabbed the lantern, shuttering it again, and pulled her toward a small, dark tunnel at the back of the chamber. They ran, plunging into the black. The tunnel was narrow, sloping down. It ended, not in an exit, but a sheer drop, a scree slope of loose rock and silver tailings. It leads to the arroyo, Macklin said, his voice tight. Slide. Don't try to run. Keep the books. Go! Alara didn't hesitate. She sat, clutching the ledgers to her chest, and pushed off. She slid, feet first, in a cascade of loose gravel and dust. The rocks tore at her clothes. She hit the bottom, falling to her knees in the dry wash. The air knocked from her lungs. A shadow detached itself from the arroyo wall. A match flared, lighting a cigar. I thought you might use the back door. Miss Quinn, Trask Hollander said. He stood 10 feet away, holding a lantern high. His suit was immaculate. The man who had burned their granary stood just behind him. Alara scrambled back, but she was cornered by the sheer rock walls. Give me the ledgers, Trask said. His voice was not angry. It was polite, the voice of a banker closing an account. You cannot steal what is already property. And you are property. Your name is written, in black ink. He raised the pistol in his right hand, its polished barrel gleaming in the lantern light. A boot scraped on the rock above them. No one, a low voice said from the darkness of the slope, owns anyone. Macklin Hayes stepped out of the shadows. He had not slid. He had climbed down the sheer rock face, silent as a mountain cat. His rifle was level at his hip. He stood between Alara and Trask, and he lifted one finger, the same, single finger from the granary. A silent, absolute command, a statement of his will. Trask's polite mask shattered, his face contorted in a snarl of pure hatred. He had been beaten by this gesture before. Fool, he screamed, and turned, firing his pistol at the shadow. The night exploded. Trask's shot went wide, the bullet screaming off the rock. Macklin's shot was simultaneous. It was not aimed at Trask's chest. It was aimed at his hand. A sharp, metallic ping echoed in the arroyo. A shriek of pain. Trask's pistol flew from his grasp. Its barrel shattered, his fingers a mangled mess. The man with the cigar lunged, raising his own rifle. He never had the chance. Alara, seeing her opening, acted. She was on her knees, next to a stack of flour sacks left by the air shaft. She was not a soldier. She was a baker. She grabbed the torn top of a 50-pound sack. With a desperate, primal scream, she heaved it. The bag split, sending a choking, ghostly cloud of white flour straight into the faces of Trask and his man. They roared, blinded, gagging, the air thick with the very substance of their greed. Now Macklin bellowed. He grabbed Alara's hand, pulling her to her feet. They sprinted down the arroyo, scrambling over the rocks, away from the choking. Cursing men, they heard Owen's whistle. He was back, by the junipers. "Hold in the horses, they're coming," he yelled. Macklin threw Alara onto the gray gelding and swung up behind her. Owen leaped onto his own mount. They rode, not for the trail, but straight into the high, dark mesa, the horses' hooves pounding a desperate rhythm against the stone. The ledgers were a heavy, righteous weight in Alara's arms. They did not stop, did not slow, until they saw the silhouette of the ranch house against the first pale gray light of dawn. They walked the horses the last 100 yards, their bodies shaking, their breath tearing in their chests. Dusty ran to meet them, whining, his tail thumping. As they reached the porch, a high, thin breeze blew down from the mesa. It stirred the small, bent silver spoon hanging from the eaves. A single, clear chime rang out, the sound of safety, the sound of home, inside. The cabin was still. Macklin lit the lamp. Owen stood by the door, his face pale but triumphant. Alara walked to the table. She dropped the heavy, black-bound ledgers onto the scrubbed pine. The sound was a judgment, a final, heavy thud. She looked at Macklin, his face grim in the gray light. Soot and silver dust streaked on his skin. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice hoarse but steady, her hand resting on the cover of the top book. "We bring light to the black ink." The bell in the steeple of the small, sun-bleached church began to toll. It was not the gentle call to Sunday service. It was a hard, insistent, iron clang, a summons that cut through the 9 o'clock morning heat and pulled at the nerves of Dry River Junction. The churchyard, a patch of bare, packed earth dotted with brittle weeds, had become a courtroom. There was no judge's bench, only a rough-hewn table dragged from the rectory and placed in the sliver of shade offered by the church wall. The town gathered. They came not in a crowd, but in small, hesitant groups, drawn by a force stronger than their fear, the promise of food, and the rumor of justice. They filled the few benches. They leaned against the fence, their faces grim, their eyes shifting from the church door to the empty road. Sheriff Brody stood by the table, his hat in his hands, wiping a line of sweat from his brow. He was a man drowning in his own inadequacy. Beside him, the pastor, a thin man named Elias, stood with his arms crossed, his Bible clutched in one hand like a weapon. They were the arbiters of this, the weak law, and the desperate moral authority. Macklin Hayes arrived first. On foot, he was not dressed as a rancher. He wore clean, dark pants and a white shirt, the sleeves rolled to his forearms. His gun was at his hip, the leather polished. He did not go to the table. He took a position at the edge of the yard, his back to the livery stable, his eyes scanning the rooftops. He was a sentinel. Then Alara came, with Owen. The young postboy carried the forged seal in its box. Alara carried the ledgers. She walked through the parted crowd, her steps steady, and placed the 3 black books on the table. The sound of their landing, a heavy, definitive thud, made the crowd inhale as one. A carriage, drawn by 2 fine black horses, rattled down the street. It was a vehicle of wealth and arrogance, and it stopped in a cloud of alkali dust. Trask Hollander stepped out. He was followed by a man Alara had never seen, a man in a pinstriped suit from Santa Fe, carrying a leather satchel. Trask himself was immaculate, his suit clean, his face pale. His right hand was heavily bandaged. a white, glaring symbol of his injury from the night before. He looked at Macklin, his eye slits of pure venom, then smiled, a thin, reptilian expression, as he took his place opposite the table. "Pastor, Sheriff," Trask said, his voice smooth and carrying, "I'm glad you called this meeting. It gives me an opportunity to address these vicious rumors." The lawyer stepped forward. "My name is Hiram Cale," he said, his voice like oiled paper. "I represent Mr. Hollander. Let us be clear on the law, which you all seem so eager to ignore. This is not a court. This is an illegal assembly. My client is the victim of a burglary, assault, and slander. And these books," he tapped the ledgers with a clean fingernail, "are stolen property." He turned to the crowd, his smile condescending. "Furthermore, my client controls the single largest supply of flour and grain in this territory. He has been your lifeline. And in response to this public humiliation, all accounts are frozen. The provision warehouse is closed until his good name is cleared. And this woman," he pointed at Alara, "is in custody. This town will receive no more food from anyone." The threat was a physical blow. The crowd, which had been murmuring with anger, fell silent, their faces collapsing back into the familiar masks of fear. They looked at the closed doors of the provision store. They looked at their children. "He'll starve us." Someone whispered. "Ilara Quinn," the pastor said, his voice cutting through the fear. "You brought these books. You have the floor." Ilara looked at the fearful faces. She looked at Trask's lawyer, so confident in his law. She looked at Macklin, who simply held her gaze, his expression unchanging, a solid wall of belief. She did not speak. She opened the first ledger. The pages crackled in the dry air. "My name is in this book," she said, her voice clear, steady. "Ilara Quinn, acquired from the Greaves Bakery, valued at 3 sacks of flour, contracted for 3 months of labor." She looked up. "I was not being paid. I was being held. I was being sold, just like at the auction. And I am not the only one." Her finger ran down the page. "Sarah Mills." In the crowd, the old widow who had given Ilara the barley seed flinched, as if struck. "Sarah Mills," Ilara repeated, her voice rising. "Acquired, valued at 1 bag of pinto beans and 10 yards of cotton. Contract, indefinite." The widow stepped forward, her hands shaking. My husband's tools," she whispered, her voice thin but carrying. "He took my husband's tools after he died. He said I owed for the funeral cloth. He said I was working it off." Ilara turned the page. Maria Gonzalez, a young, dark-haired woman near the back, began to weep, her mother holding her. Her father was sick. The mother called out, "Trask gave us medicine when my husband died. Trask said the medicine was worth 2 horses and a year of Maria's time, mending his linens. She's 16, Ilara's voice, raw with a cold fury, rang out. Tess Harding, valued at 1 barrel of water. Jacob Smith, valued at 1 Winchester rifle. Anna Peterson, valued at $5 for seed that never came. She read the names, one after another, and with each name, a member of the crowd stepped forward, a ghost given voice. The churchyard filled with the sound of their testimony, a chorus of exploitation, of lives leveraged for flour, of hunger weaponized into chains. The crowd was no longer a collection of fearful individuals. It was a single, angry body. They surged forward, their faces dark. "That's enough." "The lawyer," Cale shouted, his composure finally breaking. "These were legal agreements, signed contracts. He saved these people from starvation. He is a pillar of this community." "He is a thief," Macklin said, his voice a low growl. He stepped forward from the perimeter, drawing all eyes. He did not hold up a ledger. He held up the water-sharing compact he and the 3 other ranchers had nailed to the church door. "This," he said, his voice resonating, "is the law of survival. An agreement signed by 4 ranchers to share what little water we have. A public compact." He turned his gaze on Trask, a look of cold, hard judgment. "And this man," he said, pointing, "broke it. This isn't about private debts. Mr. Cale, This is about public destruction. He used a fraudulent claim to dam the North Stream, cutting off water to this entire mesa. He did it to starve us out, to make us weak, to force us to sign his ledger. That is a lie, Cale sputtered. The Spanish mineral grant is filed and legal in Santa Fe. It supersedes your pathetic little agreement. He owns the water, does he, Owen? The young postboy stepped forward. He was trembling, but he held his ground. He walked to the table and placed the wooden box with the forged seal on it. I am the territorial post runner, Owen said, his voice cracking but gaining strength. I handle the telegraph. After Mr. Trask filed his claim, I got suspicious. I wired the land office in Santa Fe. He pulled a folded piece of yellow paper from his pocket. A telegram. I have their reply. Owen said. He read, "No Spanish mineral grant for Dry River District on file. Stop. All water rights are public domain per Territorial Act of 1872. Stop. Be advised. Territorial seal reported stolen from governor's office last month. Stop. Use of forged documents is a federal crime. Stop." An absolute, crushing silence fell on the yard. The lawyer, Cale, went sheet white. He looked at the telegram. He looked at the box with the forged seal. He looked at Trask, whose face was no longer pale, but a dark, mottled purple. The lawyer, Hiram Cale, took one step back, then another. He deliberately distanced himself from his client. Trask knew it was over. His legal shield, his paper armor, had just been burned to ash. He saw the faces of the crowd, the hunger in their eyes replaced by a righteous, predatory fury. He did not speak. He spun on his heel and ran. He ran for the alley where his fine black horses were tied, his escape route. But Macklin was a strategist. The two ranchers who had signed the water pact, their faces grim, stepped out of the alley, blocking his path. Trask skidded to a halt. He looked left. He looked right. He was trapped. "Get him!" a man yelled. To the tree, the crowd surged, their voices rising to a roar. "No," Elara screamed. "We are not murderers." As Trask dodged back, a yellow blur shot from under the table. Dusty, who had been lying at Elara's feet, launched himself. He was not a vicious dog, but he was loyal. He barked, snapping, seizing Trask by the cuff of his expensive trousers, tearing the cloth, pulling him off balance. Trask fell, scrambling in the dust, the crowd closing in. Sheriff Brody, his face a mask of terror, looked at the mob. He looked at the ranchers. He looked at Macklin, who stood watching, his arms crossed. Brody made his choice. He ran forward, shoving his way through the first line of men, his pistol drawn, but pointing at the sky. "Back, get back," he yelled, his voice cracking. "This is the law, I'm the law." He hauled Trask to his feet and, with a shaking hand, pulled his handcuffs from his belt. The loud, metallic click of the cuffs locking around Trask's wrists was the sound of the world shifting. The crowd stopped, their anger checked by the sight of the impossible. Trask Hollander, in chains. "Take him," Macklin said, his voice a quiet command. "And seize the warehouse, seize the mine. The flour belongs to the town." Brody, now desperate to be on the winning side, nodded vigorously. "That's right. All provisions are forfeit, pending federal investigation. Seize it all, the crowd." Their fury now channeled, moved as one. They stormed the provision store, not as a mob, but as a deputized force, retrieving their stolen future by sunset. The churchyard was quiet. The dust had settled. Trask and his lawyer were gone, locked in the town's tiny jail, awaiting the arrival of the U.S. Marshals from Santa Fe. Inside the church, which was cool and smelled of old wood and beeswax, the townspeople had stacked the flour, a mountain of it, glowing pale in the candlelight. Elara stood before it, the ledgers still in her hand. The pastor, Macklin, and the widow, Sarah Mills, were with her. "The town owes you both," the pastor said, his gaze resting on Elara. "What is it you want, child? What justice do you ask for?" Elara looked at the books. She thought of the names. She thought of the fire, the fear, the cold. She did not want revenge. "I just want to erase the price attached to my name," she said, her voice quiet. She walked to the fireplace at the back of the church hall, the one used for winter gatherings. She opened the ledger to the first page, to her name. She tore it out. Then she tore out Sarah's and Maria's. She fed the pages one by one into the flames. "That's an ending," Sarah Mills said, watching the paper curl into black ash. "But we need a beginning. We cannot let this happen again." She turned to the small group of ranchers who had gathered. "We need a food committee, one that is fair, one that cannot be bought." One of the ranchers nodded, looking at Alara. "You found the books. You can read and you can write. And you have proven you are not for sale. We want you to be the treasurer, to guard this. For all of us." Alara looked at the rancher, stunned. "And Macklin," the other rancher said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You'll manage the water compact. Make sure it flows to all of us. Not just one." Macklin looked at Alara, a question in his eyes. She did not answer him with words. She just nodded, her face streaked with dust and tears. But for the first time, she was smiling. The pastor, seeing the new order settle into place, walked to the front of the church and pulled the rope. The bell tolled. No longer an alarm, but a proclamation. It rang out over the quiet town, over the dark mesa, a clear, steady sound of hope. Macklin stood by the open church door, the cool night air washing the dust from the yard. Alara stood by the fire, watching the last page of the ledger burn. He looked at her, and she looked at him. Their eyes met across the room, across the stacked mountain of flour, across the reclaimed future of the town. It was a look that held no questions, no debts, and no fear. It was a look of two people who had been to the bottom and had climbed out, together. It was a look as warm, as steady, and as vital as a cup of hot tea in the dead of winter. The drought broke not with a storm, but with a series of steady, soaking rains that lasted for a week. The water, now fairly managed by Macklin and the Ranchers' Committee, flowed freely. The land, starved for so long, drank it in, and in the field at Hidden Mesa, the field that had been planted with the town's shared seed, a miracle of green pushed through the dark, damp earth. Summer passed into a cool, golden autumn. The small, defiant patch of beans and corn had fed them, but it was the wheat, the winter wheat they had planted with the community seed. That was the true prize. Macklin and Alara stood at the edge of the field on harvest day. It was not a vast sea of grain, but it was theirs. The stalks were heavy, the heads bowed, shining like old gold in the afternoon sun. Macklin took his scythe, and Alara, her hands scarred but strong, moved behind him, binding the sheaves. They worked in a shared, easy rhythm, the rhythm they had found in the ditch, at the kneading table, and in the storm. When the grain was threshed and milled, the flour was white and fine. Alara ran her hands through the first batch, the soft powder a healing balm. It smelled like earth and sun and safety. The sacks were not the rough, anonymous burlap of Trask's hoard. They were clean, new, and purchased with the town's seed fund. Alara took a small stencil she had carved from wood and a pot of black ink. On the side of every sack that left their ranch, she stenciled 2 words. Quinn Hayes. It was not a price. It was not a weight. It was a signature, a promise. That evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sun set, staining the red rocks with fire. They were tired, their muscles aching from the harvest, but it was a good, clean ache. Macklin had been quiet all day. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, rough object. He placed it in her palm. It was a ring. It was not silver. It was not gold. It was dark, heavy iron, forged in a circle. I am not a blacksmith, he said, his voice rough. It was from the old plow, the one that broke in the spring. I heated it in the forge and hammered it round. Alara stared at it. It was thick, imperfect, and still held the memory of the fire. He pulled another from his pocket, a matching one, larger. There is no paper, he said, looking at her, his gray eyes clear and steady. There is no debt. There is no price. There is just this, if you'll have it." Ilara's eyes filled with tears. She did not weep for sadness. She wept for the sheer, impossible weight of the joy. She took the larger ring. "Only if you'll have mine." They did not call the pastor. They did not gather the town. Their witnesses were the mesa, the rising crescent moon, and the small, yellow dog sleeping at their feet. Ilara slipped the heavy iron ring onto Macklin's fourth finger. It was a perfect fit. He took her hand, the one with the faded white scars on the wrist. He slid the other ring onto her finger. It was cool from the night air, and heavy with the promise of the earth. He did not kiss her, not yet. He just held her hand, his thumb resting on the iron ring. "Stay," he whispered. It was not a command. It was a plea. "I'm here," she answered. "I'm not running. Later." The house was dark. The lamp was out. The fire was banked to embers, casting a faint, pulsing red glow. The harvest moon was high, its white light flooding the kitchen, turning the scrubbed pine table to silver. The house was silent, save for the chirp of crickets and the deep, steady breathing of two people. Ilara stood by the window. Macklin stood behind her. They looked out at the land that was now, finally, theirs. His hand found hers on the windowsill, their fingers interlaced. The iron of their rings touched. A small, cold click in the warm dark. He bent his head, his lips brushing the side of her neck, his breath warm on her skin. She shivered, not from cold, and leaned her head back against his shoulder. His other arm came around her, his hand resting on her waist, holding her, grounding her. She turned in his arms, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. They stood in the pool of moonlight, simply holding each other, relearning the shape and feel of this new, quiet peace. His hand came up, his rough fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. He bent his head, and his lips found hers. It was not the desperate, dust-choked kiss of the storm. It was slow. It was sure. It was a kiss of deep, quiet knowing. It was a kiss of shared labor, of healed scars, of a future built, not bought. He lifted her, his arms strong and sure, and carried her from the kitchen. The camera of the mind did not follow. It pulled back, out the open door, onto the porch. The moonlight touched the old guitar, leaning against the wall. A breeze, soft as a breath, stirred the strings, which hummed a single, low, resonant chord. The bent silver spoon chimed once, a clear, sweet note. From the darkness of the house came the sound of a soft, low laugh and a single, whispered word, full of promise. "Stay." Life returned to Dry River Junction. 2 weeks later, Owen, now the official postmaster and telegraph operator, tacked a new notice to the church door, right over the spot where the water compact had hung. It was an official decree from Santa Fe. The territorial court had passed judgment. Trask Hollander, found guilty of forgery, extortion, and theft of federal property, was sentenced to 20 years in the federal prison at Yuma. His assets, his illegal land claims, his hoard of flour, were all seized by the territory. The final line was the one that made the town cheer. All seized properties were to be redistributed and assigned to a community seed and water fund, to be administered by the locally elected Dry River Food Committee. Ilara read the notice and smiled. In front of the church, where she had once stood on a crate and begged, a new structure stood. It was a small, neat shed, built by the ranchers. Above the door was a freshly painted sign, the Freedom Flour Bakery. It was not a shop. It was an exchange. Ilara, as the town treasurer, managed the flour. Those who needed it did not pay with coin, they paid with labor. They mended the church roof. They cleared the roads. They dug new wells. In the afternoons, the children of the town, who had never held a book, gathered on the church steps. They had no paper. They had no slates. Ilara sat with them, using recycled, empty Quinn Hayes flour sacks and a piece of charcoal. She taught them their letters. She taught them to write their own names, not as a debt, but as a signature. Back at the ranch, Alara walked into the quiet cabin. She looked at the iron hand mill, the one she had carried from the bakery, the one that had been her auction prize, the one that had silenced the bells. She picked it up. It was heavy, a burden of memory. She walked to the high mantelpiece, above the fireplace. She cleared a space, moving Macklin's old tin of rifle oil. She set the mill down, its handle facing the room. It was no longer a shackle. It was a trophy. Macklin was at the front gate, not mending it, but remaking it. He had torn down the old, sagging posts. In their place, he was planting 2 young, strong juniper saplings. He tamped the earth around their roots, giving them water from the well. He was not building a fence. He was planting a door. Alara came and stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "It's a gate with no price," he said, wiping the sweat from his face. "It's one that opens, one that welcomes." As he spoke, the sky, which had been a clear, high blue, began to change. The air grew cool. The smell of rain, that same sharp, ozonescent Macklin had carried with him on the first night, filled the air. A summer storm was rolling in. They stood together on the porch, their shoulders touching. Dusty, no longer astray, lay at their feet, his head on his paws, watching the rain. The first drops hit the dust, sending up the smell of wet earth. Then the sky opened, a clean, nourishing, silver curtain of water. The wind rose, and from the eaves, the bent silver spoon rang out, its chime clear and sweet, a song of survival. They watched the rain wash the dust from the world. They watched it turn their fields a vibrant, impossible green. Later that night, Alara sat at the kitchen table. The ledgers were gone, all burned. In their place was a new, clean book, one she had bought with the profits from the bakery. She opened it to the first page. She dipped her pen in the ink, the pen of a treasurer, of a teacher, of a free woman. She wrote, "The day I was auctioned for flour, he lifted one finger. Today, we lifted a town. The final bell in the church tolled, ringing out the end of the day. It was a sound of peace. Dusty barked, a happy, chasing sound, at the children who were running home, their laughter echoing in the clean, rain-washed air. The high mesa, which had been a place of dust and death, was alive. Dry River Junction, once a place of fear, now shone like a pocket of hope in the vast, wild land. Macklin came and stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his iron ring solid against her skin. They were home. They had stayed. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please leave a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and give it a boost by hitting the hype button so more people can hear this tale.